let me welcome our first panel. It's moderated by Robbert Dijkgraaf. Robbert is the director of the Institute for Advanced Study. Before he was president of the, let me make sure I have the words correctly, the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences. Actually, not quite imaginable for us. In the Netherlands, he is a regular TV star, which sort of imagine in the US, somebody who had the Scientific Institute being a TV star. Well, he is. He also wrote a book which is called The Usefulness of Useless Thinking. And was it thinking? Knowledge. Of useless knowledge. And so we ripped off that title a little bit for our first panel, which will be the usefulness of long-term thinking. So let me welcome to the podium Robbert and his panelists, Matt Jackson, Yael Kalai, Madhu Sudan, and Eva Tautasch.
Switch on your mic. Good morning. It's a great pleasure to head this panel, and of course I should start by congratulating Jennifer, Christian, everybody here from Microsoft for this wonderful success. So you now have a teenager, and I say good luck with that. I say as a parent, the teenage years are very challenging, I think, but I hope that we see many, many wonderful things here. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this first panel. With this wonderful title, The Usefulness of Long-Term Thinking, or the technical title was The Usefulness of Long-Term Thinking at 9 a.m., which is kind of a challenge. I must say, when we issued the book and I talked about this useless knowledge, one of the jokes was, in this time, in this political climate, we need a kind of a prequel, which is the usefulness of useful thinking. And perhaps we need a kind of a children's version of that with coloring plates or something to make clear. But I think this will be very exciting. We will be kind of talking, I must say also, we were instructed to set the bar not too high in our first panel so that the other panels can shine. And, but in some sense, we are doing something quite special because we will be thinking about thinking. And about theory, the role of theory, and in some sense also in this kind of this great environment that's kind of created here, and clearly, both Jennifer and Christian, I know you have something with theory. You're not quite what it is, but you're. So let me just briefly introduce my panel members. So start here with Yael Kalai. She's actually you're local, in some sense, both here at Microsoft and also at MIT, computer scientist, cryptography is one of your fields. Then another more or less local, Madhu Sudan, of course, theoretical computer scientist, worked on many areas, proof checking, etc., now at Harvard. Then Matt Jackson, professor of economics at Stanford, behavioral economics, game theory. These are some of your interests. And then finally, Eva Tautasch at Cornell, mathematician, combinatorial mathematics, algorithmic game theory. That's some of your interests. So a lot of brain power here on stage. And I think I wanted to start by kind of asking each of you to say, perhaps share one example of an unexpected advantage of thinking, of theory, that you perhaps came as a surprise to you too. Madhu, can I start with you?
Oh my God.
Yes.
I thought you were going to go in.
No. I saw you relaxing. I thought I have to intervene.
Sorry, wait. I must confess, I am also somewhat jet lagged from the West Coast, and so I was about to go to sleep. So good. Thanks for waking me up.
Yes. So it's 6 a.m. for you.
As some of you may know, I've.
Oh yeah, we should be closer to the audience. That's, that was one of my goals, to connect to you.
Okay, great.
Yes.
So I've been at Microsoft, I had been at Microsoft a few years in the past, 5 years at least, and yet my biggest contribution to Microsoft was not any of my own work here, but rather a student that I contributed to the Microsoft research environment, Sergey Yekhanin. Now, he had been one of the most purest of theoreticians that I ever knew. When Silicon Valley made the mistake of hiring him, I wrote to them very, thanking them for their generosity. This is obviously going to be so useful to him and to the world of theory. And it turned out that once he was in Microsoft research, he started getting engaged in problems related to storage on the cloud. Over time, along with a very group of active researchers, and it was very important that theory was not sitting isolated on its own. They started interacting with other researchers, trying to understand what were some challenges in distributed storage. You want your data.
Can you tell us a little bit what the kind of theoretical ideas were that he brought to that problem?
So the whole idea prior to his involvement in this research was, if we want to replicate data so that you can live with crash failures, you must just completely identically replicate things everywhere. And people were aware of the idea of error correcting codes, which don't usually do this blind replication, but somehow try to recover from faults by more efficient methods. But they always thought that this is contradictory to the idea of recovering the data very quickly after a failure. And Sergey brought in this perspective coming from the world of theory that instant recovery of data or fast recovery of data is not in contradiction with sophisticated storage mechanisms. And you put the two together, very soon everybody realized this was actually practically viable.
Could you say that in some sense immediately Shannon comes to mind, something, it's kind of interesting that the kind of field of information, something was also born in theory.
In theory, absolutely. Yeah. And in many of these cases, we have seen somehow periodically, time and again, that when you abstract a problem, come up with some very complicated long-term vision of this is how I want to solve problems in the limit, you also end up with matching complementarity instantly. In Shannon's paper is probably one of the first error-correcting codes actually reported. And that was just a by the way, we can also do these things concretely. And throughout, there is this synergy between the theory and the practice that, of course, on the one hand, you want to think about the long-term limits. At the same time, you cannot but help produce useful work for the near future.
Yeah, I'm not skipping you, but some example from your field.
Yeah, sure. So there are several. I think the one I want to maybe point out is one of probabilistically checkable proofs. So when I was a student here at MIT, in one of my classes about this idea of probabilistically checkable proofs. Okay? What are these? Very counterintuitive. Usually proofs, you check them line by line, you verify this implies this, and so on. Probabilistically checkable proofs, you have a proof, you just read a few bits. One here, kind of random location, you read them, based on that you decide if the statement is correct or not. Turns out, you can do that reading 3 bits. In 3 bits, you're convinced with probability 1/8, the statement is correct. And so actually, when I was a student, I read it. So Madhu is one of the pioneers of these works. He wrote a very nice survey about it. I read it. I was just blown away. In theory, of course. I mean, who would generate a proof? I mean, the proofs are long. It completely uses a lot of algebra and error-correcting codes. And so it seemed like it's a really, really very nice work in theory. Everybody, thought it was a really, really nice work in theory, which clearly will not have any applications in practice. And there were a lot of theory works, and a lot of the time, everybody thought it was beautiful, but what people didn't like about it, it's very far from practical and will never be used. Today, these are used in many of the cryptocurrencies that are out there. It has been implemented. There are many groups that are kind of working on it right now and trying to optimize it. Turns out, it does really well in practice, and it's used. So this is one of the that seemed, it's on.
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
No, I got anyway, it's really remarkable.
Is that, by the way, a theme that you said this is an interesting fact because in some sense counterintuitive? Right? Is that a theme about theory that in some sense it might actually kind of remove some of our natural biases that we have? Because I think certain areas we have very little intuition, certainly if it's deep mathematical complexity.
Right. I don't know if it's a theme or not.
Yes.
It's a very it's a good question.
I want to also ask you something about cryptography, because there's a great number theorist who said often the applications of number theory to cryptography is that these are basically very difficult problems to solve.
Right.
So he made this point that number theory was always seen as the complete, Hardy said it's the most useless thing ever, and that's why it's so beautiful. And this mathematician says he wants to kind of solve these number theory problems to liberate his beloved number theory. So can you say something about this? How kind of modern mathematics?
Right. So actually, that's a very good point. Actually, number theory is a very good example of something hard problems. The fact that something is hard. Okay, what is useful in that I have a conjecture that I can't solve? Turns out that's all cryptography is based on that. Without that, we wouldn't have crypto. So, and that's a very actually basic example of, and yeah, all of cryptography is based on, I mean, most of it on number theory, some of it on elliptic curve style, which is also some analytic form of number theory. And it's all based on hard conjectures and the hardness of problems that people don't know how to solve. So yeah, actually, if he succeeds in his mission, I'll be out of a job.
I don't want to turn to you. Continues the session. I feel this is Theorist Anonymous or something. You're an economist. That's something that the social sciences are a very interesting domain. Where would you? What kind of examples did you bring for us about?
I think as somebody in the social sciences, it's fairly obvious now that game theory has been transformed, able to really understand and structure a lot of problems where people have different interests, they come together in all sorts of different settings and interact. And if you trace back the real seminal contribution, it was John Nash's 1951 paper where he basically set up the problem. So if you look before that, von Neumann and Morgenstern had really started game theory, or it came in the 20s, but they sort of set the structure. And they set the structure in terms of zero-sum games, and it was very elegant mathematically, but it wasn't the right setting to actually apply to many settings where people have interests, but they're actually gains from interacting, right? So most of the situations we're in, the fact that we come together, there's synergies, we're better off acting together than apart, and so zero-sum games don't capture 99% of the settings we're in. And Nash basically set the structure of, he proved existence of an equilibrium point, but the more fundamental contribution was just setting the problem up and saying, here's the action spaces, here people can take different actions, they get payoffs from these, we set it up, and now we find a solution. And the fascinating part about it was, if you look at what was going on in the 1950s, this was a branch of mathematics, and the social sciences were completely separate from it. Nobody had any idea that this was going on. And if you fast forward, you go into say the 1970s and 80s, that's when it started to be picked up. And it wasn't really, if you look at, say, the 1980s, you'll see papers by, say, Milgram and Weber that use this to then develop understandings of how auctions work. Right? In an auction, somebody's selling something, there's different buyers that value it at different things. There's different values that can come out of that. That's not a zero-sum game. If you get it in the right buyer's hands, it's more valuable than the wrong buyer's hands. How do they bid against each other? So this gave them the tools to understand that, and then fast forward again, and you look at the spectrum auctions that are run by the FCC and so forth, and those are based on these theories. And after Nash won the Nobel Prize, he had mental illness for quite a while and was sort of completely out of it and had never seen what had been developed from his theory. There was an interview with Roger Myerson interviewed Nash after the Nobel Prize, and he asked them, isn't it amazing that your theory has come so far and now is basically transforming the way that we study things, and things like auctions are now being analyzed using your structure. And he said, what do auctions have to do with? He had no idea of the connection, right? I mean, and sometimes when we're doing theory, it's very hard to see where that.
Of course, the purest of pure mathematics.
Yeah.
I always like the anecdote when he described his theorem to von Neumann, that von Neumann said that was totally trivial.
Exactly, it's just a fixed point. It's just
it's just a fixed point.
Exactly, it's just Kakutani. Whatever, who cares about it? And somehow, it was the abstraction and the clean structure that was very flexible that made it powerful. And once eventually the social science could make use of that framework, that's the real contribution.
Right? It's the saying nothing is useful as a good theory. Right? That's a good example. Funny, Eva, in your field.
So I guess I was thinking of something maybe more boring and mundane than some of the examples we have seen so far. But given that you actually introduced me as a mathematician, I admit there's some truth here. I do have a mathematics PhD, but I kind of stopped thinking of myself as a mathematician a long, long time ago. So maybe that's...
I want to create some diversity in the panel. We have 4 theoretical computer scientists.
Back of what made me switch to CS instead of pure mathematics was thinking of, I like the idea that the maths or the theory we're thinking of has some connection to applications. That was very appealing, and that's basically what made me think that maybe it's more fun to work on this sort of math problems than more abstract things. And I guess, the fact that our theory of applications is motivating our whole field, at least theoretical computer science as a field. Sometimes the application is visible right away, and sometimes we get criticized that it's not sufficiently visible. One classical area where this happens a lot is or happened for 20 or 30 or more years is approximation algorithm. So when some problem turns out to be computationally hard, then a theorist or a theoretician's idea is that, okay, how close can I get to the optimum? And there certainly in early years, there was a total dismissal of this as whatever, who cares? And, and this is coming back as a theme over and over again, sort of along the lines that Yoel mentioned in a different context. Like if you use very powerful mathematical tools, in the early years, the problem was that people used linear programs. Nowadays, they're using sum of squares, even worse. And then it turns out these things are actually useful. Like at the moment, the sum of squares, I can't vouch for it yet, but I think it's going to happen. But certainly the linear programming-based ones, we now have very much faster solvers for that special kind of linear programs that tend to get used, and they turn out to be very useful as actual tools. Beyond actually the sort of taking the algorithm and the guarantee and translating into real world, and maybe that's sort of the bigger point here, these algorithms tend to offer an understanding of what's going on behind them that very often, at least in the approximation algorithms world, leads to algorithms that really work much better than the theoretical guarantee. So going back to the classical example I used, the linear programming-based one, or actually anything of convex optimization-based one, convex optimization comes with a primal dual equal sort of guarantee. Even though in principle I could only prove this is a 2 approximation or a 4 approximation or something even worse, in any particular instance I have something in my hand, usually a full solution, that gives me that, yeah, I proved that this was a factor of 2, but hey, in this application it's 10% up, or in this application it's 5% up. So it leads to much, much better algorithm than what the guarantee it gives. And once it do that, because it offered some sort of understanding. So in the last 10 years, or maybe more than 10 at this point, I have been working a lot in game theory, and this approximation algorithm framework got translated into what's over there referred to as a price of energy. That is, taking a system, trying to understand, how much damage selfishness does to social welfare. It's a little bit different than the approximation algorithm because often the price of energy is not explicitly, in fact, it's more explicitly suggesting whether you should or shouldn't do something rather than directly suggesting a recipe what you should do it. Like that. traffic routing is kind of okay doing it selfishly, then because it's not so much worse than the optimum, then it's reasonable to, don't bother with designing routing, like very careful routing systems. This sort of, everyone choosing a shortest path appears to work pretty reasonably well. What we're missing, and I hope we're going to get there, is the analog from approximation algorithms where we can evaluate individual better than we can evaluate the worst case guarantee. Happened in approximation algorithms, almost all approximation algorithms, better on data, and we can prove it. We have a example-based guarantee how good it is, and at the moment, there are very few examples of this sort of thing, of the price of energy on a particular instance. But we do have some, and it's a developing field, and I guess this is sort of pushing the more abstract theory into something that will actually more directly have impact.
So we heard quite a few examples from theoretical computer science. So is there something, perhaps, and you're quite right, sometimes I feel people's minds, there's either the usefulness or something, or there's the intellectual depth. It kind of adds up to 100% something. So is there something like the almost a curse of usefulness, in the sense that if you're working something that everybody feels immediately clear, this has great applications, that you have to fight somehow to also develop the theory behind it?
So I think actually at the end of the day, I'm kind of referring to your question, to what you asked now and to your earlier question, that I think at the end of the day, what is very useful? At the end of the day, often these are just beautiful ideas. It's your example with Nash, it's a beautiful idea. And sometimes when your goal is just to kind of get something out there now, like, oh, I want something that'll be the fastest now, you're not actually looking for something, you're goal driven. You want to just solve this it's not about a beautiful idea. And I think the things that last, the things that are, I don't know, to me is like a probabilistic checker proves. So it's just the beauty of the idea.
Can I dig a little bit deeper here? Because I kind of noticed that, we here in the panel will use beauty and beautiful ideas. We all agree, I think everybody in the room. I notice like artists don't dare to use that word anymore. I think scientists are the last one. So but if you think about a beautiful idea, aren't you kind of secretly already seeing that this will have like many ramifications or something? Or can you just try to put a few words on how you would capture that beauty?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So essentially you're asking, can you define what beautiful means? Yeah, so it's a tough one.
But there's a notion of connectivity to other ideas, right? This is kind of a central idea.
Yeah, I can tell you what, in some sense, what is not beautiful. I mean, what it's a little bit when it's something that is solving a question that's there now that needs to be solved, but if someone else does it, kind of nothing is left. So if I succeed in solving, but someone else solves it in a different approach and he does better, what I did becomes useless. Or not interesting anymore. That's not a beautiful idea. A beautiful idea is even when someone else does it differently and it's better than me, the idea still lives. And if it's really a good one, a beautiful one, then it will find its place elsewhere.
So it's long-term usefulness.
It's long-term usefulness.
We summarize the panel, we can kind of all go home. But I want to ask you a question about economics, because just a little anecdote. I once was at a talk of an economist, and I was with a friend of mine who studies medieval, alchemy, etc. And he said that talk was just, it's like alchemy in a sense. And his point was that, sometimes in economics it's like hyperscience or something. Somehow people can be captured by the models, etc. And so the models are determining the real world instead the other way around. Is there anything like this, of an overshoot, so to say, of theory or models in economics? Because in the end you're also dealing with the real world and determining people's lives.
Sure, and I think that what's important in any field is to understand where models work well and where they don't, and understanding exactly how fairly simple economic systems work. If you increase people's wages, where are they going to spend the money? If you're changing tax rates, what's going to happen to labor supply? These kinds of things are well understood.
They're not sexy. They don't appear in the news. But the kinds of things that people are interested in is when's the next financial crisis going to hit? You know, that's hard to predict. Now you've got a very complex system. You've got all kinds of interacting things. The modeling is not very good. People are going to be willing to stand up there and give opinions. And you know, by its very nature, people have to make predictions. And so economics is used as a predictive science as well as one to basically understand systems and to evaluate policies. But I think its strengths are not in the areas that appear in the media, but more in areas that are sort of nuts and bolts kinds of things. You know, if you want to design a new system for you know, getting out a program in a developing country, what's a good way to incentivize people to participate? These are kinds of questions where, you know, economists are making progress and so forth. It's very different from predicting the next world recession or, you know, these kinds of things. And so, you know, you get this idea that it's alchemy and so forth from looking at people pontificating and going way beyond the reach of the models. But there's areas where the models apply very well.
Actually reminds me of another, I think it was in Nature Science a few months ago, and the title was Machine Learning is the New Alchemy. And I want to ask all of you a little bit about the world of data, etc. So I think, you know, since many of you have a background in computer science, I mean, that's kind of a wonderful field because it started in theory, right? It's with Turing and Gödel, etc. And it's kind of, by the way, fascinating. It started with negative results, something, and then it led to this blossoming field. Now we also live in a world of big data, machine learning, AI, or something where it looks almost like you can fit. And why do we need theory anymore? If at some point we have a machine that will be fitting patterns, and if you want to kind of start a discussion around that topic.
So, I mean,
yes.
There's a lot of, first of all, you know, we want to, simple models that we understand things as really give us an insight of, you know, when are these things working and when are these things not. And econ and this game, an excellent example where, you know, things are not this very simple games theoretic setup. It doesn't always fit the right word. In fact, I think no economist would claim that it does. I hope I'm allowed to say this. Yet, the fact that at Nash equilibrium, and it has an immense impact because it's such a simple theory and so much insight is really coming from this. Machine learning at this point is less good in understanding where the limits really are. And I hope that in the next, you know, I don't know what the time scale is, but say 10 years, our understanding of what these machine learning systems can do and what are the limitations will have an immense improvement. You know, machine learning is really popular right now, and a lot of people are thinking about trying to develop a better theory, and I really hope it's happening. And I don't claim that, or not even hope, that the theory will fully explain exactly what machine learning can do. The same way Econ 101 doesn't fully explain the whole economy, as Matt just admitted. But it will offer a basic understanding, hopefully along the line that game theory offers a basic understanding of a lot of econ systems. And the second part is, a lot of the systems we developed, especially in understanding the economy, you now have to combine in this new version back to data. Nash equilibrium is a very stable, like one, you know, steady state of the word kind of understanding of how the word works. And the current state is everyone using data and everyone reacting to data. That's not how it works. So there are sort of interesting challenges that I think, again, many of us are working on. What happens if I take the Nash kind of equilibrium ideas, but combine it with that the players are all reacting to data, they're all learning, and, you know, develop extend the theory in this direction, which I think another thing we need to do.
So is your guess that these ideas will come from the field itself, or that we need, just like Nash was coming completely from left field, you know, as a
I think a lot
abstract
of the
mathematician?
people who are concretely working on this right now are more coming from computer science. I don't think they're coming from left field because the econ CS interface is so strong. So I guess this lab is an example where such things are happening, but there's a whole conference out there under the name of Economics and Computing, where a lot of these people get together. Their NIPS, which is one of the big machine learning conferences, last year had a workshop on learning and games. So even the NIPS community recognizes that this is an interesting application of their word. Learning and games workshops happening elsewhere also, but I saw the fact that NIPS hosted one of them was that NIPS, except NIPS as a community, understood the importance of working in this area.
Madhu, you have thoughts about it?
So first, a little bit about the, when you say, if things are working well, then why do we need theory?
Yes.
The fact that things are working well says something about the past, and it says about problems that we tried to, that we encountered in the past, where we're able to solve them. Even a company like Microsoft likes to think about the future and say, well, we're going to sell this piece of hardware, this software, this platform. It should be working N years into the future. And when you want to have this predictability, you do have to have a theory. It might be very elementary, not the most sophisticated stuff that we are always working with, but it should be able to have some predictive power. And this is roughly what we are always striving towards. And the simpler the predictive power gets, the more theoretical the answer. That's my definition of theory, beauty, everything is, the more you can actually say, take an idea and apply it in multiple situations, this is good. So the other handicap with working with the problem that you are set today is you forget about the potential generalizations of a solution that you may have discovered.
Yeah.
And of course, machine learning is an entire theory of generalizability, but I would even say that, look, this is what drives all of our, theoretical inspiration. We want to take ideas from here, apply it there. In order to go from this point to that point, we have to find some common abstraction, which actually combines these two, but also ends up including a lot more in the fold. So I think theory is interesting, and I consider any work which does this kind of an abstraction theoretical. Anything that we can teach is theoretical. Something that is not living purely in a system that we have hard-coded, which I cannot ever remember again, is, as Yael was describing, those are not theory for me. But when we can try to abstract something, go beyond the limits of what has been described today, those are fantastic things for theory. So I think this is what we are striving for, sort of, simple ideas which explain a lot and have the potential or the possibility to explain a lot into the future. One more point, then I'll pass it over. A comment that I heard from a statistician recently, and I just loved it when I heard it, was, all models are wrong. Some are useful.
Great. Perhaps this is a moment to, if you're still, or you're ready, awake, to get a few questions from the audience, and then we'll can try to kind of get the next round of reactions. I think it. Are there microphones? Is there? Is there? I can do that. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
Here.
Yeah. We have two. Yeah. You don't even have to run.
Hi. Well, thank you very much for the panel. It was very great. Okay, I'm Parisa. I'm recent PhD graduate from Boston University and recently joined industry. I've worked in machine learning and information theory both. And to me, information theory is one of those beautiful ideas because no one can, once it's proven, no one can say it's wrong. And so I feel like it shows the path to the future. And then because you said we need prediction for like all these learning algorithms, I was wondering what is the connection between these two fields, because maybe information theory could be a good useful tool for predicting what are the limits of any specific architectures of learning algorithms. What do you think about this?
Come back to it. Let's see what are the other questions. Perhaps take. Here we go. Somebody to. Yes, here. Oh.
It's actually not a question, it's just a comment, because I think it relates a lot to the last statement and to the question about beauty. There are actually, because the models are actually just an interpretation of the world, there are actually some artists that are using economics models as a way to interpret or express their own vision of the world, and then they actually tweak them and caricature them as an abstract, or as an impressionist will actually try and put its own personality into the interpretation of the world. And so economic model actually become a form of art in terms of reinterpreting the world.
Okay. So somewhat beautiful as well.
Yeah. Great comments. Yes, over there.
Chris Bishop from MSR Cambridge. I wonder if you could say a little bit about the communication between theorists and not themselves, but the consumers of the theory. One thought I have in mind is, so I'm in machine learning, but I wouldn't consider myself a theorist, but I'm sort of interested in a consumer of theory, if you like. One piece of theory from the second wave of neural nets was the theorem that 2 layers of neurons are sufficient to approximate any function to arbitrary accuracy. And of course, it's a proven rigorous theorem, so it's correct, it's not going to change. And yet, did it distract people from thinking about deep learning? How should we interpret theory? That's my question.
Great, yes, that's a wonderful question. Any other? And otherwise, we'll do another round. Yeah. We'll come to it, yes. Yeah. Great. So I would like to start with this kind of last question, which I can almost rephrase. So there are many elements to it that I want to come back. Perhaps the first element that, sometimes theory can suggest something and then progress being made to go around it or something, right? So it could be, so anybody wants to perhaps technically answer that question, why the 2-layer network didn't prevent thinking from deep learning?
So I mean, none of us is probably
an
expert at the same level as Chris.
That means you're qualified to give an understandable answer.
One thing that I see definitely is that when we answer questions in the theory land, they are often precisely formulated. We answered the precise question that was asked, but then there was something else in the background saying, "Oh, but I always meant something else." Yeah. And that was not abstracted into the question, and the answer completely fails to get to that point. So there is a constant interaction, which is why it's not the case that every theoretical paper sort of changes the world. There is a constant interaction between the applications and the theory in these kinds of settings, and many times I would suspect in the deep neural nets also, we forgot some aspect of, yes, we wanted to maybe approximate every function, but it also has to be learnable by some simple mechanism. The kinds of data that is available may not be captured by the kind of data that was used to prove the depth tool result. So we have lots of different possibilities on what could vary. The interesting aspect of theory is that we throw away a lot of these details in order to solve the problem, but the details start to become important and rise to prominence once you've solved the first problem.
So I guess we, by taking extreme limits, all agree that the world just run by theory is not good, and no theory is also not good, so it's somehow in between. Can any of you say something about what should be kind of the right ecosystem? It's almost like how, if you want to structure a world where there is all these different kind of niches, and how should they communicate? Yeah, I have some ideas about it.
Yeah, so actually, my main area of research is cryptography. That's exactly an area where there's theory of cryptography, but then people actually use cryptography, and there's kind of a very interesting, exactly this ecosystem of the theorists on the one hand, and someone should try to take things from theory land to practice land, and that is actually very, very important. This kind of middle person, these middle people who are supposed to deliver, is a very, very important group, and I think that part is actually tough. I feel like actually as theorists, we're a strong community.
You have to be bilingual to do that?
Yeah, you need to be bilingual. The theory community is strong. The application, the people who apply things are strong. But in the middle, the people that actually move, and the reason is, I think exactly what Madhu said. First, often, we have models. For me, something efficient is polynomial time computable. That's how I define efficiency.
It's not us.
Somebody.
So, can I
yes.
object
Eva.
to your basic statement that not everyone should be a theorist? I teach at the university for a living.
Yes.
This semester I'm teaching algorithms to 300 kids. This is their required course, so next semester Bobby Kleinberg gets to do this, and that's combined our whole class. I do actually want every single damn computer scientist to understand the basic thing. And the same way Econ 101 or whatever the large level course is, does teach game theory and Nash equilibrium to every economist at every university. Yeah, true, definitely. If you take theory that's getting developed in last 10 years or right now, and if that's going to have a short-term or immediate or in the next 10 years impact on industry, then definitely I'm not objecting. We do need people who are versed on both sides. And your question was like that because it's a developing field. But at the end, I do want some basic theory by basic understanding to actually migrate to literally everyone who's touching the field. And I guess I do that for a living.
But I think that Robert wasn't saying that. He wasn't saying that not everyone should understand basic theory. He was saying that not everybody should be a theorist. So it's,
Well, we can capture it. I think that was the idea. You can have a beautiful theorem that kind of finishes the field, so to say, and then actually the field can go around it. And we have many examples.
I actually agree with Madhu that it definitely didn't finish the field, in the sense that even as that theorem was developed, they did know that training that neural net they have no idea how to do, or they don't have a theory of why that's trainable. So the sort of reason why deep nets are better right this very second, namely they have to be trainable. That was already an open question then, so it's not, it was a simple model. But there is the sort of shorter term impact, which is already long term for industry, like 10 years, and then there is the really long term impact. And yeah, of course, not everyone should work on the longest term theory. We need to live together. A lot of advanced that make that progress happen. But I think we need to strive that some basic theory and sort of elegant, beautiful theories that explain a lot of what's going on in the world, that should be out there with every practicing engineer. And
Matt, do you agree on that?
Yeah, and I was going to say, I think one way to put it is that people should think like theorists in a way, so that theory forces you to understand what are the key things I want to focus on. I can't do everything at once. So I have to distill things into some set of variables that I think are going to really be important, and then I have to attack the problem in a systematic way. And I think so obviously research is faddish, and it makes sense that people go all to that now there's an intense interest in machine learning, and it makes sense for a lot of people to be working on it, and there's synergies there, but at the same time, pattern recognition isn't going to be the only thing that works. You have to know what you're looking for, and as Madhu said, you're thinking about the future. The system's going to change, so you need some structure of how is the system going to change? How do I make predictions about the future in completely unseen versions of the current world?
We're talking about long-term thinking. So clearly, we're in the first decade of the lab. So 10 years seems to be a lifetime. But if you look at your own fields and something, so what is the lifespan of truly deep ideas? Are we talking about many decades? And then the question comes, how do we sustain these kind of ideas? I love the idea, Madhu, that you were saying that something theory is also very helpful because it's something you can teach, that you can kind of can transfer to the next generation,
Right.
which is very difficult from just kind of experience or something. Yeah. So some ideas about what the time span is and what's kind of necessary to bridge these long time intervals. How do you keep a theory alive, so to say?
Okay, I think here we defer to the sociological aspects of the field, and let the people more or less decide. I have sociologist friends in the audience. I think, for the most part, we just tend to leave this to personal taste and the activity levels that is sustainable by a field. And we don't.
But are these personal choices completely independent? Because they're to some extent driven by external factors.
Absolutely. I think we have to see the questions that are driving the field. We have to see some of the ability to make progress on the questions, just saying here are problems that have been open for the last 500 years and we're going to work on this for the next 10 years doesn't seem to be a good way. Well, the good news about even this kind of an approach, I could try this approach and I will not be able to recruit students into this field. So I think there is a pretty strong phenomenon where students, the new people entering the field, tend to also take us in different directions, and this often ends up being the most primal force. And so who can we recruit? I mean, today we see excellent people who are trained as theoretical computer scientists drifting towards machine learning. Why is this happening? Because there are important problems there, there are challenges there. And we're not going to drop everything we know, but we're not going to work on the same old problems necessarily when there are so many other compelling things. So this is a live field, and it's a
there are some young people here in the audience. I can trigger any of the kind of graduate students here or something, but what they think about the role of theory and long-term issues. I see a graduate student right there.
I'm not a grad student, but just a quick comment. I love the panel, by the way. Give you a quick scenario, which is a little bit different. We've been hammering on a problem since 1998 on ideal web crawl, and it's gone through some theory, some practice, empirical tests. We finally hit upon the most theoretical analysis of this, and it's the most practical and going into service. It took us literally, we didn't work on it constantly, but intermittently, hammering on this for 20 years and only having a lab like this, and thank God Redmond is 27 years old, where we actually fostered different teams of probabilists in this case, so working with Yuval and Ayala Lipetsky and so on. We got to the theory that was most practical. Different kind of twist on this.
It's fantastic to hear.
I would like to give you an example of a good case of long-term thinking, which actually was at the Institute for Advanced Study. The mathematician Vladimir Voevodsky unfortunately passed away last year. But he was a great algebraic geometer, got the Fields Medal, then found a mistake in one of his papers. And he was very surprised to find a mistake, but even more surprised that nobody cared. And then he thought, well, I have to rewrite the foundations of mathematics so that the computers can actually understand, in his case, abstract homotopy theory. And so he then spent 10 years, essentially without producing any paper. And I would say, it's like a whale diving very deep. And then at some point you're worried, well, will he come back to the surface? And he did. And I think it was quite a successful program. And it might have a big impact, but it makes me think, do we have places where somebody can be underwater for 10 years or something? And in the end, we all benefit. Obviously, when he was not producing anything, are you worried that he will not come out? I think, well, if somebody spends 10 years thinking about it, and you finally come with a result, you have a 10-year advantage, which is terrific too.
That's an amazing example, and there are other amazing examples. Also, less amazing and less famous examples who spend 10 years
and never.
Eva, can we save that story for later?
I really like that our field, and actually your field also, like economics and theoretical computer science, you have to start when you write a paper, you have to start by explaining some sort of long-term thing. Like, good research doesn't necessarily solve the fundamental problem of the field of the universe, because there are very few results of that sort. So most days, day in and day out, each of us cannot, or I cannot, produce results of that sort. But I have to write an introduction that explains why do you need to care about, why is this the step in a possible direction where there is a big hill that we really care about. And I admit the machine learning people now have it easy. There is a very clear big hill over there. But everything we're working on, we're constantly pushed to explain the goal. And that's usually the intros of all of our papers. And without this, people sometimes do that, and occasionally they're successful, but I think sometimes they're less. And I really like that I'm getting pushed. And I guess there is one example from my early years that I've been pretty public about, where I wrote a paper where in the break after I gave the talk, Lotzi Lovas very, very gently and very politely came over and, yes, but why do you care? And I was so embarrassed that I can't defend myself that it took me, I forgot, many years till I even wrote down the result. I did write it down. It is actually published in Journal of JCT, Journal of Combinatorial Theories, thank you.
Yeah,
so it was a hard paper, but I think I learned a lesson, and this is the lesson I promote, is that we need to think, even before we get involved, of why do we care? And I guess he knew why he cared, because he was so famous and well established. The community trusted him. But I think the fact that we regularly have to write about our partial results and explain that this is a good goal has two giant benefits. One, it makes us think about this, which is good. And second, we recruit our friends or our colleagues to help. Much of the results that we're achieving are not a single person's achievement. It's anything that the two of them talked about for crypto, from error correcting code, there's a community working on this.
Yeah,
so
you want to add something?
Yeah, so I think the long term is that, I agree with you completely that you need to have a goal in mind that you think is worth going for. But now the goal can be one that you think will take you a long time to achieve, or one that, you just want a paper because you need your tenure. So, you're thinking of the flexibility. And I think the long term, clearly we need both, because like you said, life is happening now and we want to advance. But also clearly we want the long-term one, because that's where the really deepening ideas come from. And some of us, I'm not saying everyone in this world should spend now, go 10 years underwater and think deeply. But some people should, because we need some good ideas, and it's dangerous. I agree with you. You can, sink in and die there. So it is a dangerous, journey. But I think that's where it's an important one, and that's where a lot of wonderful things happen.
And actually, I think, maybe one comment on that. I think, stepping back a bit when we think about who supports research and what their, why they support it and what their goals are. That's a very difficult part of research, right? Because there's a huge value in these deep dives and new discoveries that are going to be transformative many years later. And often those aren't the ones that are going to have immediate payoffs. And so you need large benevolent organizations like Microsoft or universities or something that are willing to fund labs that are allow people to take deep dives. And that's not...
I think that I noticed that people who do completely different, like financial investments, often they have a risk budget. They have to really spend so many percentage on risk, and they can do it. They can distribute it in their. I guess that means we have another 8 minutes. They have a risk budget, and they really measure, so to say, the level of risky and less risky investment. I don't think actually we do this.
No.
At least not in a very conscious or quantitative way.
Exactly.
Should we do it, or
yeah, I think that somehow it's difficult. Research is done in a very self-organized system, right? It's people out there just doing what they want, and there's some incentives and carrots and tenure, and you have to keep producing at some level, and you have to justify what you're doing, and so there's landmarks and goals, but the overall picture of how we're invested and who's doing what, there's very little coordination. It's just like a lot of humans, like ants, marching around, all doing their thing and hoping that we coordinate and produce good things. And there's enough of us that good things happen, but...
Does any of you believe that there is kind of an optimal distribution?
So I'm very wary of any form of metrics being used to determine what's a good researcher, who's a good researcher. One of the that we have to keep in mind is that we are taking a wide spectrum of people over here and then going to the very, very, very tail ends to determine, these are the people who want to be researchers. Applying the theory of predictability, which is supposed to be somewhere sitting around the middle of the bell curve, to a population which is sitting at the extreme seems to be extremely dangerous to me. And unfortunately, this is getting practiced too commonly in universities, tenure systems, promotion cases, etc. And we really have to be wary about it. So every one of us knows by personal familiarity that the people that they admire were not the ones who sort of aced the metrics. These are the ones that came up with the brilliant ideas and probably came up with the brilliant ideas almost out of nowhere. At the same time, to see, should we now try to manage this process is very dangerous. I love, by the way, the Microsoft motto or principles by which they were hiring and they were managing the research labs, which was we decide who we hire, we don't decide what they do. I think it was a wonderful principle, and I hope you're going to continue this. Oh, yes. It was when I was here, and after that I forgot.
But I mean, I think it's fair to say that both that principle and the long-term goal, and it's great to be here with an organization that values this. But I hear a lot of complaints that in some sense that open space is shrinking. That, for instance, 50 years ago, even famously you had Bell Labs and other places that were producing many Nobel Prizes and somehow had more oxygen or something than typically now you see around. Any of you agree? Is the world getting better? Is it getting different? What's happening?
I think that at the end of the day, you're asking whether there should kind of be a managing kind of research. I completely agree with Madhu 100%. But there is such a thing by definition because there's money. You need money for it, and someone needs to decide how to distribute the money.
Yeah.
And that mere distribution defines it's a definition of what the world thinks of as important. I mean, important is where the money goes. I mean, that's kind of, so that's, I mean, one, so there is such a thing happening by necessity in a sense.
I think, humans are good at reacting to crises. They're not good at long-term investments and thinking, and that's a really difficult thing to do, to sort of say, look, we want to fund this, it's going to be great, let all these people take deep dives and we'll see 30 years from now what happens. Instead, you're looking at we've got this pressing problem and let's solve it. So it's a very difficult thing to do, and the funding becomes essential because these kinds of things can't be done without that kind of funding.
I want to object to there are two issues we're raising. The deep dive as in going into an area which doesn't, produces interesting, amazing things and not necessarily have immediate impact, and that you have to do it all by yourself. I don't think you have to do it all by yourself. And I think the pressure to publish or pressure to talk about partial results as, sometimes some people take it the wrong way and work on something that doesn't have a long-term goal, and I object. But the positive impact of the very same thing is that when you publish your partial results towards a big goal, then usually there's a whole community out there who suddenly sees that, hey, good point. The goal might be reachable. Let me work on this. There is a hope out there. So your partial results are recruiting a community, which is not against the main goal idea.
Well, I think we are getting close to the end of this first. Perhaps one more question. Yes, please, and then we'll finish.
Do you think the lag will change now that people are communicating better? There's no longer necessarily a 30-year lag between the time that somebody has a great theoretical result and it's applied?
Yeah, perhaps that's a good question, and then I'll finish by ask you a very short question about what's kind of the future of thinking, of how do you see, perhaps mention one element that might change the nature of theory, the nature of long-term thinking, when we are looking in the future. So if you're here in 10 years, celebrating 20 years of the lab, what will be different?
Let me make a quick answer to Adam. And this actually, Kevin Leighton Brown's in the audience, and we've done a MOOC together, 2 MOOCs together. And I think now the dissemination of knowledge is really amazing. And being able to teach game theory to people around the world in a large scale that they would never have had access to means that there's a very different landscape that we don't quite understand yet. But it's very, very encouraging when people who otherwise would have no access to this kind of knowledge can now become part of the team, become recruited, and help producing future knowledge that's going to advance the society.
Madhu?
So also a quick sort of reaction to Adam's question. I think as we are communicating better, faster, I'd say not necessarily better, one of the advantages is, of course, you hear all the good news very quickly, you also hear all the fake news very quickly. And this does not apply only to realms like politics and society, it's also applying to scientific results. We all heard about the proof of the Riemann hypothesis a few weeks back. And these kinds of events, I mean, we do have to worry a lot about, there is a lot of material being generated. Simply the volume is very high. Even if you have infinite bandwidth coming in, there is sort of limited bandwidth going into my brain. So I think we're going to have, this will be a process which will, some things become better. Maybe your geographical distance from the center of the discovery is no longer as relevant, but having intellectual mass at the place where you are is still going to be relevant. You're alone in this, isolated place. You can be very well connected on the web to every piece of development and still not really get it.
Eva?
I love Adam's comment, and I think that's a big part of the future. And machine learning is an excellent area where this is really happening more powerfully. By the time people submit their paper in machine learning to NIPS or ICML, usually it has some insane number of citations because they put it on archive first. And people already started to work on follow-up and using it, which is amazing. And I think, I don't know if we'd be ever as fast as the machine learning community is, but this speed of people reacting to each other's ID improving, I think will help science go further, faster.
Yeah.
No, exactly.
Okay. Terrific. Well, I want to thank all of you for being awake and participating. And so I think in the kind of self-congratulatory nature of academics, we want to kind of celebrate this wonderful institution here. And happy 10th anniversary.
Thank you. Let's thank the panel.